Hello, everyone. This is John Ford from Tryon. We are a Marsh & McLennan agency based in Philadelphia that specializes in employee benefits. And I'm joined today by my colleague, Craig Dancer, the Managing Director of Marsh Transportation Practice based in Washington, D.C. I want to thank everyone for attending today. I know this is a busy time of the year, and we're appreciative of the ability to spend this hour with you. And we're also appreciative of all the questions that you've provided, which will go a long way to help frame our conversation today. We've assembled a great panel of industry leaders to discuss really the next phase of COVID response and preparedness as we approach the fall. The fall brings a lot of complexities and new complexities to the response to COVID. As the virus continues to progress and we continue to adapt our response, we add in new complexities such as a return to school, or if you're in the Ford house, the non-return to school. Some companies are slowly but surely bringing back employees. So how does that change your response? And then there's also the looming concern of a second wave. So how does that affect your employees? How does that affect both the governmental response and recommendations? We received, as I said, a number of questions from everyone today. We hope to get through all of them, if not the majority of them. If we don't, then we certainly will circle back afterwards. What I thought I'd do now is hand it over to my colleague, Craig Dancer, to talk a little bit about the question and answer aspect of the presentation.
Thank you, John. You will see on the bottom of your screen a Q&A button. So if you want to, so at any time during the presentation, please go ahead and click that button if you have a question, and we'll queue it up so that we'll be in the process of working through the presentation. Peter Lynn, who we'll introduce in just a minute, will be presenting to us for about 10 minutes on a return and work and retention employee strategy. And then after that, we're going to open it up to the roundtable. Again, we've got, as John mentioned, we have a number of questions that we received in advance, but we'll also be queuing up the questions that you'll be asking today, again, using that Q&A function at the bottom of the screen. So Susan, do you want to put up the presentation? And so today, on today's presentation in our roundtable, I want to introduce Michael Horak, who is the Risk Management Director for Academy Express. Mike's Academy Express is located in Hoboken, New Jersey, and they are the largest privately held bus company in the United States, which operates 1,200 buses throughout the United States and Canada, and 22 locations along the East Coast of the United States. Prior to Academy, Mike was held a number of positions in the P&C industry, as well as is currently a member of the TSA Motor Coach Peer Advisory Group and the Commercial Safety Vehicle Alliance and Passenger Carrier Committee. Next is on the panelist is Todd Birchfield. Todd is currently the Vice President of Security Investigations for Covenant Transportation Group. And as part of that, he's been with Covenant in the past 10 years based out of Chattanooga, Tennessee. And he's worked in the security, risk, and loss prevention for over 25 years in a number of different business sectors, including retail, distribution, and transportation. And Todd's expertise has been responsible for other infectious disease prevention awareness programs during H1N1, the normal flu season, and currently overseeing the COVID awareness and response programs of Covenant Transportation. Peter Lynn, who we'll hear from in just a minute, is a managing director within the Marsh Advisory Services, responsible for supporting and advancing client total cost of risk solutions through coordination with Marsh's industry practices, risk practice leaders, and external channels. Peter's worked with industry leaders, risk managers, and safety professionals around the world on various topics, including digital engagement, leadership, and safety management systems throughout various EH&S, and recently focused on COVID-19. John, you want to talk about, introduce Nancy and Amanda?
Sure. So as Craig went over sort of the risk side of this call, I'm going to introduce the HR side. So first is Nancy Stefanowitz, SPHR. So Nancy is the SVP of Human Resources at NFI based in Camden, New Jersey, and has been an integral part of NFI since 2006. Nancy oversees all HR functions for NFI's employee base of over 8,500 employees in North America. Nancy serves on the executive leadership team, where she advises on the strategy and direction of the company with a strong focus maintaining and expanding its reputation as a top employer and the relationship between NFI and its top customers. Under her leadership, NFI has been named on the Philly Best Places to Work list, as well as receiving the Human Resource Department of the Year Award in the Delaware Valley. In addition to Nancy, she's also joined by Steve Truno, the SVP of Risk Management at NFI, to kind of shed some light on any of NFI's risk issues and so forth. Next, I'd like to introduce Amanda Thompson. Amanda Thompson is the Chief People Officer at US Express, headquartered in Chattanooga, Tennessee, the nation's 5th largest asset-based truckload carrier by revenue. In her role, Amanda oversees all human resource functions, including total rewards, people analytics, employee relations, talent development, acquisition and retention, as well as policy creation for US Express's over 9,000 employees. Okay.
Terrific. Thanks very much. So Peter, perhaps you could again introduce sort of the concept here that we're talking about in terms of reemerging and remaining healthy and strong as the country starts opening up, and as companies navigate the waters as far as bringing employees back to the workplace and retaining them.
Yeah, thanks, Craig, and thanks, John. It's a pleasure to be with everyone this afternoon. You can imagine that from the Marsh side, we're having these types of conversations and have been having these types of conversations now with clients all over the country. Really started in earnest probably late February, but really sort of ramped up obviously in March as this COVID-19 situation emerged in the US. And when we think about the pandemic cycle, we think of it in 3 phases. We think of it in first a response phase, which is what most of us were going through, even starting in January, beginning to think about, okay, what do we need to do to respond? Then there's the recovery phase. Once we get past that, okay, here's what we need to do, put the policies and procedures in place. What do we need to do to start our business, or more importantly, perhaps to continue operating our business safely, I mean. And then the third phase, which is the resiliency phase, is the more longer term look of how did this impact our organization? What fundamental changes do we need to make in our organization to be able to prepare and respond for another event of this type? Because the reality is this: COVID-19 is not the first one of these cases, and it's not going to be the last. Now, granted, it was a very significant case. We've learned that many organizations, even the ones that thought that they had prepared well for it, really hadn't prepared well. So what do we learn from this? How do we become more resilient in the future? But today, for the purposes of today's conversation, we're really going to focus on this, what we call recovery, almost maintenance phase at the moment, and really focusing on our people, right? What does this all mean for our employees? Employees, as well as people that we interact with. So even if it's not an employee, if it's a vendor, if it's a person in a general public person that we might be interacting with, what are we thinking about in terms of the people aspect of it? And one of the things I always like to remark on at the outset of these calls is the fact that every single person on this call has been impacted by COVID-19 in some form or fashion. Whether it's on a personal level, some of us have had either family members or acquaintances who have been directly impacted by COVID. We've had, many of us have been affected from a workplace perspective. We may not be working in our regular workplace anymore. We may have been affected in other ways, in psychosocial ways, kids being at home, all these types of impacts. And all these types of impacts that we're talking about take a toll. They take a toll on the people that we have. The stress increases. There is when we think about being in the workplace now, whether we're returning to the workplace or whether we've stayed in the workplace, there is now a fundamental trepidation amongst the people. They're worried about the environment. Am I putting myself or am I putting my family at risk by going back to work? Or by doing my job? that type of stress, that sort of psychosocial aspect of what's happened here is something that we need to keep that in mind. And when we talk about these various strategies that we'll be touching on in just a moment, people are different. The people that left the organization, the people that have stayed with the organization, they're not the same folks they were last in January, in December in 2019. It's funny, I think about January of 2020 seems like ages ago, right? When we think about everything that's happened since that time, it's almost like a different time. Pre-COVID, now we're in, we're still in the COVID situation, depending on what part of the country we are, depending on what part of the country we're traveling to. Some areas are doing a better job controlling it than others, but I think you get the idea. We're all affected. We need to keep that in mind. Next slide, please. This is a busy slide. And I appreciate the fact that this is a busy slide, and my intent here is certainly not to go through every single point on here. This is more of a memory jogger and sort of talking points to keep things in mind. And there's a couple of things that are basic within the COVID-19 response, and when we're talking about keeping people at work or returning people at work. And the first part on the left-hand side talks about what do we need to be thinking about if we haven't already done so. We're talking about things associated with safety. We're talking about things whether it's in the home work environment, or whether it's in an office environment, or whether it's in a vehicle or a truck or any type of transportation. What are the safety things that we need to be thinking about? What about litigation? Litigation is no small topic. Litigation is a significant topic in the sense that we're thinking about whatever we have decided to do, whatever policies and procedures that we've decided to enact. What have we done to protect ourselves as best we can from any sort of future allegations or claims? A very important consideration. How do we know that what we have put in place is actually working? What about the potential workers' compensation angle here? There's most of the clients that I'm speaking with are concerned about that. They're concerned that there could be an increase in workers' compensation as a result of COVID. If a resurgence occurs, if there's a second wave, or maybe when there's a second wave, how are we going to adjust to that? And what are those indicators that our leadership should be thinking about to sort of keep their crystal balling a little bit into the future as to what's coming down the pike? Can we respond in a very nimble way? It's interesting that when it first came, when COVID first hit us, we were in a situation where we had to respond quite quickly to the situation at hand. Some people and some companies have been able to plan their response in a more long-term basis, especially folks who maybe have moved to a home office environment. Maybe there's not an immediate urgency to get them back into the office. On the other hand, a lot of folks in the transportation industry, essential workers, have been working the whole time. So we want to be able to a certain extent, see what's coming down. And health readiness. So the basic concepts of entrance protocols, and entrance protocols, and this means entrance into the work environment. And the work environment obviously takes a lot of different forms, but things that we've probably all already experienced, surveys, self-assessment surveys, exposure surveys, and temperature checks, masks, right? Huge topic, masks. It's a topic within COVID. It's just a general topic around the country. And then there's these workplace preparation. We're talking about things such as ventilation. In some ways, you can argue that the fact that we can open windows in vehicles, we can get increased ventilation is a positive. But generally speaking, cleaning and disinfection of the workplace, whether it's a cab, sleeper berth, bus, whatever the case may be, cleaning and disinfection considerations, common spaces, keeping people as far apart as possible in common places, signage, surveillance, case investigation, Isolation of cases when we have employees who have tested positive or have been potentially exposed. Contract tracing, I'm sure we've all talked about that, trying to identify an employee who has been exposed or has contracted the virus, sort of tracing back the individuals that person may have become in contact with, quarantining rules, which in some cases vary state to state, jurisdiction to jurisdiction. Where do we stay when we're traveling? And this whole notion of touchless interface, electronic invoicing of fueling and deliveries. These are all things that we should be thinking about. And we have put out, Marsh has put out a document, which is a guide to COVID-19, and it's a lengthy document. Some of you may have received this document or a link to this document, which is available for download. It's available to everybody who wants to read about it. We're going to send out a link to this document at the end of this webinar, so all of you will have access to it, and it provides all of this information in far more detail than I have just provided. Next page, please. Okay, a couple things. What works? What we know works from a clinical perspective. What we know works is we know social distancing works. We've talked about this. I'm sure we've all talked about it. Social distancing is not always possible, but it does work. Cleaning and hygiene of our workplace, or however our workplace presents itself, works. Masks work. Masks work if they're properly used. If we're using the right type of masks, they work. There's one other item that's not on this chart, which is receiving quite a bit of increased attention lately, and that's ventilation. Ventilation has been shown to have an impact. And one of the interesting things about ventilation is it might be intuitive to think, well, the more air we pump into an area, the better. And generally speaking, that may be true. The more atmospheric turnover we have, the better. But there are also situations where some studies have shown that by putting too much air into a system, you're actually sort of churning up the atmosphere to a point where if you have potential exposures, you're actually increasing the flow of those exposures. So there's it's a little bit of a developing area, but clearly ventilation is something that's becoming a noted area of intervention, especially within the workplace. Really over the last 2 weeks or so, there have been some studies that have come out about it. And we can talk about that further. One more slide, I think. I'm sorry, I have 2 more slides. Workplace litigation. This is one of the most common areas of inquiry we get from our clients. What I'm doing, I've made decisions to protect my workforce. I've made policies and procedure decisions to try to protect the people that we engage with, even if they're not employees. How does this potentially put me at risk? There are a number of considerations. The first consideration, of course, is to consult with counsel, whether it's in-house counsel or external counsel, because the laws do change and they do vary a bit from state to state, and we know that. However, generally speaking, we have to be careful in terms of FMLA and ADA type of considerations. And again, this does vary to some extent state to state. Discrimination based on what decisions we're making in terms of what people we're bringing back, when we're bringing them back, and how we're bringing them back. We've seen cases where there's been discrimination claims filed. We've seen hostile work environment type cases and claims being made. And to be clear, just because a claim is made doesn't mean a claim will be paid. But the fact of the matter is we are seeing an increase in claims. Class action claims under the WARN Act, under COBRA, under OSHA. We're seeing this type of activity. And one of the things that we say as a general suggestion is whatever decisions are being made, be sure that you're documenting the decisions that you're making. So it's very, very clear that if there ever is a claim or an allegation, you're able to go back and say, we based our policies and procedures on these various reference sources, recognized reference sources on such and such a date. Because one of the issues that we have here, folks, and I'm sure you all know this, is that the landscape is ever changing. So whatever decisions we make today may need to be changed a week from now, or 2 weeks from now, or a month from now. Next slide, please. more types of workplace litigation claims to be thinking about. Retaliation and whistleblower claims. We are seeing these happen where an employee is saying, I do not feel that my employer has provided me with a safe working environment. I have reported this to OSHA or some other authority, and now I'm in some way being acted upon by my employer. This has happened. Remote workforce claims associated with people now working from home. There's a different dynamic in terms of how we're working together. There are potential human resource considerations for people who are working at home around their families and hours and things of that nature. And lastly, no surprise, anything privacy or biometric related, if we're going to be taking temperatures, if we're going to be doing any kind of medical screenings or medical tests, there's the potential for possible biometric related claims. Again, absolutely critical to consult with in-house or external counsel on these issues, because they do vary a little bit here to there. And I believe that's my last slide. And it is my last slide. And I'm sure everybody's very disappointed that we only had five slides. I know that we're not used to that. But the important part of this is, that was just a little bit of a background as to where we are today. What I have found in having many of these types of conversations is the dialogue that we have with our clients and amongst our clients is really where the information sharing can take place. It can be very, very effective. Many of the questions that are going to come in that we've seen already, other firms, other clients have already faced this and have already taken action on some of this. So I'm going to stop there and pass it back over to Craig and John to lead us through the rest of this session.
Great. Thank you. Thank you, Peter. Appreciate that. So we're now going to switch over to our panel discussion. And again, there's a Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. So if you'd like to ask a question, or as we get into the conversation with some of the questions that were, again, a number of questions that came in through the RSVPs. So we're just going to try to go through many of them. And if we don't have time to go through them, we'll try to get to those after the call is done. But again, if something is please by all means use that Q&A function. So I think, a lot of what we want to talk about, we've all lived in this sort of COVID environment. And I think, getting perspective, from your industry peers is really, I think, some of the best way of figuring out, best practices. Because I don't think, we can say like in an ergonomics or in a driving trainer kind of situation where we can really have best practices. Given the unique nature of this pandemic, I don't know that there really are, frankly, best practices that we can follow other than the best practices for your individual organization based on your own experiences. So, and again, having the combination of, from the HR perspective as well as the risk perspective, we thought it'd be great to just sort of open it up and start having a real discussion about the issues that people are facing in companies and questions as we navigate in this environment. And really, it's not about trying to figure out, we've already been living in this for 4 to 5 months now. So now it's really about, where do we go from here? What do we think is really sort of going to be the next issue that we're going to have to face? So what we've tried to do is take your questions that you've asked and also put some additional thoughts together that we would talk to our panelists about. So the first question that we're going to talk about is sort of, I think something that's going to be an issue, which is really not about necessarily bringing your employees back, but we're sort of in a competition here with the environment that was created post-COVID and sort of this rush to sort of keep the economy afloat, keep people getting paid. The government passed a tremendous amount of stimulus. Part of that stimulus was enhanced unemployment benefits. So one of the issues I think a lot of the people in the transportation space have had issues with is we had problems getting our employees back to work, particularly our drivers and our mechanics and our staff that help book loads and manage the drivers. So we were, as an industry, we may have seen a small lull, maybe once we got past the initial rush of March, April, May kind of was pretty tough, but then, volume have really been coming back. And Mike, I know, you're in the passenger transit side, so obviously you're not seeing as big a rebound at this point, but, certainly in the cargo space, we've seen a tremendous amount of uptick. And that's created a lot of problems because now we're already we now have a huge demand pressured by a previously existing driver shortage. And now we've also got competition in the, you know, with the government looking at more stimulus going forward. So I guess I'll open it up to, you know, to you guys on the panel. And maybe if you could talk about sort of what are you seeing in terms of trying to get just people off the couch and getting them back into the environment.
Nancy, do you want to take this one from an HR perspective?
Sure. I wasn't sure if we were to do that. Sure, I'd be happy to. Thanks for that, Craig. So I think, you know, we're all facing that, and you did a good job laying out all the challenges that we've had with, you know, increased demand and volume up, and, you know, we're all competing for the same talent. So a couple of things on the NFI side that we did. First of all, we didn't furlough anyone, so they never went to their couch. So we really consider our folks to have been, you know, our frontline workers to be our heroes from the start. So we've done a good job in maintaining the workforce that we had. On the warehousing side, we did have a challenge because we had to furlough some folks because of loss of business at the beginning from some customer closures, TJ Maxx, et cetera, that, you know, that had their workforce laid off. So we've seen about 88% of those folks come back. And the other, you know, percent we are really having to make up through additional recruiting. And I would say where we've gotten creative on the NFI side is to really open up those talent pools and recruiting from a much more diverse set of applicants before than we ever had on the distribution side. On the trans side, our turnover has been great. You know, our drivers have been true and staying with us, and we're so appreciative of them. We've tried very hard to keep a very safe and communicated philosophy with us. So our employees know we're providing all of the PPE, all of the cleaning, everything that's essential for them to feel safe so they can come to work safe and return safe. And we're also have increased our recruiting efforts on the driver's side to just increase to keep up with the capacity. So I think it's a combination and more of an and strategy, Craig, than an or strategy. And we're glad that the stimulus is going to be decreased, right? We know that the $600 is not going to be here. So we're very encouraged by that and hoping that the opportunities that we have continue to attract those folks.
Mike and Todd, how are you guys? Are you feeling this on the risk side or on the safety side?
From our standpoint, I mean, we're kind of in the same boat as Nancy. I mean, we've been very fortunate that our drivers have really taken the, I guess you could say, an honor to be classified as critical infrastructure for the United States. And the one thing I will say that we have done as an organization is we've really been transparent through this whole process. You know, if we have drivers that test positive, you know, we share those numbers with our drivers, and we've learned from it, and we learn from it in-house as well. But I think the key is really being transparent with your team, but also letting them know that you care about them. You know, a lot of times, especially when you're talking to OTR drivers, you know, they feel like they're out in a silo. And if you don't reach out to them or you don't communicate to them regularly, they just think you forget about them. So I think that's what's benefited us. I think we also have experienced some challenges with our warehouse teams, those that, you know, that were not critical at first and did have some time off because the plant may have closed down, and then they started getting some unemployment. But we also were very fortunate that we didn't have to furlough any employees, including our mechanics and so forth. But again, I just think it comes back to the transparency and making people feel comfortable and knowing that you care about them and that you're doing everything you can to make sure that they go home to their families safe like we do as well.
Hey,
Yeah,
John, this is Steve.
Mike, go ahead, Mike.
I absolutely concur with the communication piece that's essential through this, communication and education. Unfortunately, our industry was not so fortunate, being frontline mass transit, passenger mass transit. 80% reduction in operating is probably the best, with many companies just closing their doors permanently at this point. It's been a real difficult process. So unfortunately, furloughs and layoffs are required in a survival mode. But again, as was said earlier, Those that we have retained have been providing extensive positive feedback just on the communication piece. Those that we did have to furlough were temporary furloughs and continue to be so, with the inclination that they will return to their jobs once business picks up, hopefully once there's a vaccine and the marketplace picks up, because just like airlines, passenger transportation, mass transit, no one wants to travel in outside of their private vehicles unless they have to. So it's going to be an extensive challenge for some time until that vaccine is in place and the public has the comfort to return to that. But again, those that are still with us and those that will be returning, we constantly communicate with as to exactly what we're doing to protect them, what we're doing to provide the benefits to them. And we've continued to pay for health insurance while there's a temporary furlough as an incentive. And it's much appreciated based on the feedback we've been getting.
Steve Truno, did you have something you wanted to add?
I was just going to reinforce the comment Mike just made, and communication is essential, but one of the learnings for us as an organization has been not only the communication, but the education. And we came to realize there was a lot of misinformation and misunderstanding about how the virus transmits, whether employees are exposed just coming in the building. And so while we may have initially assumed a lot of that information was being gotten through our communications as well as what's in the media, we came to realize there really was a misunderstanding. So educating people, making sure they understand the protocols and the safeguards that we're taking as an organization to protect them and their coworkers and their families was really important. And we did that through a variety of means. But one of the most effective we found was doing town halls or transportation management meetings. So we're talking to the associates and giving them opportunities to ask questions.
I want to add to that just a little bit. That's an extremely important point that was just made regarding the education, and or you could even go as far as to say it is a training aspect to this, because there are employees who are now being required to take certain actions within their workspace that they haven't had to do before. We're talking about the cleaning, the disinfection, the using of PPE, etc. So the training aspect is extremely important, and it's something that is a moving target. So the training is almost a constant, the very high frequency activity. And as I mentioned earlier, when I was talking about the potential of the liability side of the house, documenting that training and what's being trained and what the basis of that training is absolutely critical. And then the other piece that's been mentioned here, and I think we can't overstate this either, is the notion of empathy. Showing empathy towards the employees, and everybody's going through stuff. And as organizations, when we show that empathy to our employees, it goes a long way to increasing loyalty to the company, making people feel more comfortable in some cases, very unfortunate circumstances. And I know that, speaking for myself, I think the Marsh organization has done a terrific job in terms of doing this communication, and in fact, also a type of training as well. So again, documentation and frequent training as things change, very important.
Amanda, I'd love to go just kind of pivot to the next question and start with you on, as the fall comes, schools start or don't start, and childcare issues. I think back in March, we were all scrambling, kind of dealing with childcare issues. And then I think we found a nice balance, and it seems as if we're approaching getting a little out of balance again as kids go back to school. So I'm just curious, at US Express, what are you guys doing to help employees as they deal with childcare issues and back to school and so forth?
Yeah, thanks, John. I don't mind taking that question. So about 95% of our employees are still at home, that we transitioned from the office are still working at home. And we do know that some of those employees that are still in the office, that dedicated to counts, and some of our shop employees are still going to struggle with this issue. We recently submitted a survey across our organization to find out what those types of issues are going to be, and if there's hybrid learning, or if the students or dependents are still going to have to go to school at home or virtual, or are they going back to school. And If they go back to school, we know that they might get 1 day's notice. I think here in Chattanooga, we had schools that started back yesterday. And of those schools that started back, 2 have already reverted back to virtual learning. So we know that that was going to create a hardship on our employees. So we wanted to be proactive in that. And we did this survey with all of our employee base. We tried to find out what those issues might be. And we narrowed those down and went and had individual conversations and tried to work on flexible work solutions for them. Some of those solutions might be that they have flex hours. Some of it might be that we might exchange shifts for somebody. They might end up going and working on night shift if they have, both parents on day shift and they both couldn't. One parent had to be there with the child learning. And I know that all of those situations varied from person to person. So we really tried to instruct the directors and vice presidents that we were working with that we need to come up with flexible options to keep those employees without losing work productivity. I'll say it's not easy. We're still learning as we're going. We're still trying to work through some of those challenges, but having a 13-year-old myself, I know that when we went home in March of last year, it wasn't as structured and everybody was just trying to figure out virtual learning. And now if he was to come home now and I was to have to do my job and, help him, it would be a huge hardship. So we're just going to continue to try to work with these parents of these children and try to come up with flexible options.
A question for you, Amanda, and sort of expanding on that. I mean, have the organizations, for those of us that will have the opportunity to have our kids go back to school, I mean, it sort of almost opens up, a whole nother risk parallel in terms of, okay, now, and this is sort of, I think, what some of the school systems are grappling with. It's like, all right, you're now bringing in all these people from all these different places, and then they send them home again every day or every other day or whatever the protocol is. So now we're kind of opening up our circle, our little network. I mean, we've gotten used to this cocoon environment where, all right, I know I'm going to Costco or I'm going to Target, but, pretty much I'm at home and that's pretty much it. So what are organizations thinking about as far as, again, you're now exposing sort of your personnel who might have to come into the office and their kids were just at school and somebody was exposed. How are organizations trying to deal with that or thinking about that?
I think it's probably the same exact approach is that we took a few months back and just educating and communicating and making sure that everybody is watching for those symptoms and that they're reporting them as quickly as they can so that we can take action. We have still decided to do as much telecommuting as possible from now until, I think we've even said until the end of the year. We've decided not to make any major changes until then, just so that we can continue to learn to see what this virus is going to do and to plan and prepare. But that doesn't impact those people that are on dedicated accounts or those shop technicians. And so we are continuously communicating to them, just take the necessary precautions and please, please, please communicate to us if you start feeling symptomatic at all. So I don't know that I've got the golden answer for that, but I think it just all has to come, just like with others said, is transparency and just over communication and education.
One of the things that we did, so one of the things we did identify to add to that, because you're right, we don't know where people are going or what they're getting exposed to, but we have put in an app that the employees need to answer a survey and questions and also take their temperature before they come into the office. So if they did go to Costco, we're going to know, but we're also going to know if they had a mask on, if they maintain social distancing. So every day, and then you get a green, red, or yellow if whether or not you are allowed to come back to the office. Now, it's pretty much in a prototype state because we, like Amanda, are still working remotely and are figuring out our plan for what the next chapter is for the corporate office. So we're kind of trying it out before we go. And, we've had some bumps and some other, but we've also learned a ton. I think, one of the other panelists mentioned it, and we're able to kind of shift from what we learn. We're also finding in the field, right, a little bit more challenging. So a driver might have had some care over the summer that might look different if fall school closes. So how are we going to accommodate those frontline people too is sort of still a work in progress because, we don't have the app there and we don't have the ability to let them work from home. Obviously, they're hands-on folks. So we're continuing to work through that with the business presidents on that side and beginning to do our trial basis on the corporate side and, learning as we go. I think maybe you said it, Peter, if anybody does get the perfect playbook, please pass it along because we're ready to implement it too. So.
And whatever, if you have the perfect playbook, send it immediately because certainly by tomorrow or by Friday or by Saturday, it already have been needed to change. And I think that's obviously one of the challenges here is the ever changing landscape. But I think, Nancy, to your point about the apps, the sort of the self-screening apps, there's quite a few of them available out there right now. More and more of our clients are going to an app-based self-assessment, self-screening option. And by and large, the response has been good, right? They're easy to use. They're fairly effective. Are they going to have, a major impact at the end? For example, temperature screening, we know that, 40% of cases are asymptomatic anyway. So is it gonna have really a moving the needle impact? We don't know that yet, but what we do know though, is that as people get into the habit, right, of being aware of their surroundings, and this goes even beyond COVID, being aware of their surroundings, being aware of the actions that we're asking them to be sensitive to and watch for, it does create a certain, let's say, safer behaviors and safer mindsets, which is good for all our employees anyway.
Okay, great. Craig, you want to take the next question?
Sure, thanks. So obviously something that I think is probably front and center in terms of, the quick, as somebody mentioned earlier, the sort of the quick nimbleness that most companies had to take in terms of migrating their employee workforce out of an office environment and into their home, working from home environment. So I think, cybersecurity is obviously something that has to be top of mind for a lot of organizations. And, we've seen in the news, there's obviously a significant uptick in terms of the bad actors out there, whether it's the North Koreans, et cetera. Any sort of, I think, lessons learned or sort of, what are people looking at proactively to address sort of this whole new environment that we're now having to deal with in regards to cybersecurity? And if there's any sort of anecdotal information that can be shared, I think that'd be tremendously helpful. Todd, do you want to sort of kick us off with that, since I know that's probably something in your wheelhouse as well?
Yeah, sure, Craig. So one of the things we knew that there's going to be vulnerabilities there once we went remote, with some employees not, really taking cybersecurity the way they would here and be protected as well as they are when they're inside the main buildings within the organization. So we really just ended up rolling out an entire new training program that made sure everybody took the training, understood what what could possibly affect us going through this pandemic, because we didn't know how long it's going to last or how long it was going to last. So by doing that, it really raised the awareness. But I think as we look back on that, which we did that, probably I think we started near the end of April, beginning of May, we're going to have to revisit it again, because as with anything you roll out to any of your team members, it just falls by the wayside. So it's that continuous education, but more importantly, it's putting situations that do occur, whether it's at a competitor or a peer company, letting our employees know, look, this is actually happening. This isn't just, Todd being overreactive or trying to be overcautious. This is how it's happening. This is how easy it happens. And this is how it could happen to our organization. And by doing so, it allows them to say, to accept the fact that it could happen to them, and really raises the awareness across the brand.
Thank you. And Mike, I think you've got some practical, some experience here, because I think you're in charge of cybersecurity there at Academy as well. So do you want to just sort of give us some input on sort of how you guys are seeing the, any increased threats and how sort of you're dealing with?
Yeah, in line with what Todd just said, it's a constant vigilance effort, and it was so prior to COVID, more so now with COVID because of, all the remote accessing the networks. I am not an IT technician, but interact with that department. And I've also interacted recently with Homeland Security and the FBI, and these attacks, they have seen a substantial increase from certain actors that we know who they are, that allocate millions, literally millions of people between these countries that sit in offices every day, and their sole job, their sole purpose in life is to access anything U.S. In addition to the non-governmental actors, which is ransomware for the most part, where they'll hold your network hostage. And there's been thousands of successful penetrations in this area over the last couple of months, in addition to what was a normal level prior to COVID-19. Partnering with experts to build your firewalls and to educate your people and to put in constant monitoring services so you know if there's malware entering your system is critical. If it's something that you can afford to put into place, you should. Charles River Associates, CrowdStrike, Palo Alto Networks are a few of the players in those fields, and they can make all the difference between you losing your network and not.
And this is Steve at NFI. Just to add to that, about 2 years ago, year and a half, 2 years ago, we really ramped up our cyber security initiatives and training. But with the remote workplace, we did even some more. And one of the things to follow on a point that was just made is the importance of educating people of not opening suspicious emails, and our CIO and his department actually, through some proactive measures, would actually do some sending out emails that look suspicious, and to see if employees were understanding the training they've been providing and actually acting in a quick manner, which is to report it to IT and not open it. And because ransomware is the issue, one of our insurance brokers, just as an anomaly, had ransomware. They were down for almost 6 days, their email system. So it's real, and every company is susceptible. So important to be vigilant.
And for clarification, it wasn't Marsh McLennan, right, Steve?
It was not Marsh McLennan. Sorry about that.
Very fun. Shifting gears a little bit, well, we had some questions come in about testing. So curious, what are you doing? Are you doing anybody doing any mandatory testing? If an employee gets tested outside of work, what are you doing? Are you making them show proof based upon the test results? Just a little feedback on what you're doing around testing in general.
So from our perspective of what we are doing, so if somebody does call in and say that they tested positive, we are asking for a copy of the positive test result, just because we know that we're going to do the contact tracing, and we're going to go back and try to contact all of the people that they have actually came into contact with. And we don't want to we have had a couple of false positives of people that have said that they are positive, and at the end of the day, they weren't. So we just want to be very careful when we're reaching out to others that they may have come into contact with, that that in fact we do have a positive test. So once we get that positive test, then we do very similar probably to the health department, and go back and just try to verify and contact everybody and give them the option and ask if they have been exhibiting any of those symptoms, and giving them the option to quarantine as well. But we are doing that today. Now, as far as requiring a negative test or anything like that before an employee comes back to work, we are not requiring that.
This is Mike. I'll add to that. We don't require mandatory testing for anyone. However, as was said before, we do use an electronic app service that's tied in with our MRO, our medical review officer, who's a physician, that reviews every employee every day, completes a questionnaire relative to their current health. It's responded to immediately by our MRO and the service. And if there's any issues relative to concern, they are contacted immediately and not told not to report to work if there's a concern or if quarantine is needed. And then depending on the nature of why they were not allowed to come into work currently, because it could be a secondary contact, it could be primary, it could be symptoms. Then a decision is made by those physicians relative to requiring a test prior to returning to work. Normally what we're using right now is a PCR test. It's a 3-day lab test. It's the reliability is substantially higher than these POC nasal tests. So that's all left up to the physicians that are interacting with the employees to make those decisions on who returns to work, who doesn't, and what's required before they are allowed to return to work. All documentation, all conversations between the physicians and the employee. So HIPAA protected, no concerns there. And then it's a very black and white format that's followed for every employee. So there's no discrimination issues also. The employees have actually contacted us time and time again and said they really appreciate the interaction that they have with that MRO, not only as a screening and response, but as a resource when they have questions as to their current health.
And as a follow-up to that, it's a question we're going to get to a little later, but how is everybody doing their contract tracing? Does anybody have anything different? I mean, is it just sort of an informal questionnaire? What's been your process from a contract tracing standpoint?
From our standpoint, I mean, we're very fortunate, you know, to the fact that we have the ability at most of our facilities have access control, and in addition to closed circuit, obviously security cameras, but we also rely heavily on the interview, on the intake when the employee calls to report that they have tested positive. But we also start beforehand. If the employee does go home, you know, let's say they were exhibiting symptoms or that they came in contact with someone, a family member who's at home who's being tested, we automatically start looking at it from that standpoint to go ahead and get ahead of the game. Where in that way, if we do have a positive, we'll already have those individuals identified and we can reach out to them and make sure that they go ahead and self-quarantine and also seek medical care as well.
Yeah, at NFI, the safety and HR team are doing the contact tracing. It's effectively a manual process. We've introduced some automation in collecting the information on the intake, but the same goal is intended is to try to identify where and to whom those associates may have been in contact with. The good news is that we have identified about 285 positive cases since March, and probably less than 10 of those cases were work related. Most of these cases are, as a result of their lifestyle and other activities. But it is an exhaustive process. It's a team of individuals that work 7 days a week collecting and going through this information. We did look at a couple of options using technology and cell phones, and for a number of reasons, we elected not to go that route at this point.
Okay. I guess along those lines, one of the questions came in about social distancing. I think this is probably something you guys have a fair bit of experience with at this point, but what were some best practices that you had around social distancing? I mean, that's really important around your warehouse employees. So maybe Nancy, I'll throw this over to you. Was there anything specific that you guys did from a social distancing standpoint?
You know, John, that's a hard one because, some positions just aren't conducive to it. So, requiring and providing the proper PPE for folks. But for the most part, the positions that we have in the warehouse are able to be socially distant from just by the nature of the job. So we did a lot of education, a lot of reinforcement, a lot of manager training to the earlier points to ensure that managers knew how to run the floor and that employees, at the end of the day, we found that employees wanted to be safe. They were very interested in what the protocol was. They quite often provided their own PPE, but knew they felt very comfortable and safe if they needed it when they came into a warehouse. And like Steve said, fortunately, we've been very, very vigilant on it, and the virus has not spread as a function of the inability to socially distance.
you know, and I think the other aspect of that question too is, and Todd and Mike, I'd love your thoughts and comments on this is, you know, I think you're right. I mean, Nancy, in the warehouse or in the office environment, you probably have a little more control over, you know, telling your employees how they have to act and be responsible. And, you know, you can train them, and as an employee, you can direct them to do what they have to do to stay safe. But, you know, when you think about sort of the diverse nature of sort of the over-the-road guys or the drivers, Mike, in your situation on the buses, I mean, you know, if you're entering a customer location and they're not, you know, wearing masks or socially distancing or whatnot, or you're picking up passengers and you're, you know, on a bus, and, you know, how do you regulate a third party, I guess, in this instance? I mean, there's obviously CDC guidelines, I mean, but, you know, to what extent can you really police that? And it kind of puts you, I guess, in an awkward position as well. Because again, these are customers / you know, passengers in your vehicles.
Yeah, well, obviously, just the nature of a bus doesn't present itself well for social distancing. You know, an enclosed environment, close quarters, presents a heck of a challenge there. But there's different facets of the business. So you have charter operations, private contracts, and then you have your line runs and commuter operations similar to buying a ticket and anybody boards the bus. Those are the most problematic, because where the public just boards the bus on and off in any given situation, it could be a local transit operation corner to corner, it could be commuter operations, it could be line run. The person is getting on the bus, they're well advised in advance through ticketing and websites and postings of what our policies are and what the requirements are to be on that bus, which is mandatory wearing a mask, social distance if you can. Obviously, right now, buses are not full. So there is opportunity to social distance, which most people, as the conversation has been today, most people will do the right thing and make that effort. That's the biggest challenge. The drivers are not going to, for the most part, have the responsibility to police the public on who's coming on and off the bus as to what they're doing. It's just not practical. There's enough of a challenge just driving the bus in traffic and dealing with everything else that's going on for a driver to have to start getting intervention with passengers doesn't work. And there's actually been cases where across the country where that has led into volatile situations that we don't want to expose our drivers to. But for the most part, given the lack of ridership right now, it's not a big problem. On the private contracts where we're moving private groups, they actually are not only willing and able to comply with corporate policy, but have their own policies, which they require us to become proficient in and provide, that exceed what might otherwise already be in place with a normal COVID-19 response. So, for example, they want certain drivers, if certain drivers are going to move certain pools of people, they want the drivers tested prior to doing the move. The bus is disinfected, sanitized, cleaned prior to the move. It's cleaned intermediate while the group is off the bus before they get back on the bus. And that's done by the driver through foggers or other equipment that we have, that a bus can be disinfected in a few minutes, and then the group re-enters. Those kind of things have taken place and have had a very positive outcome. Everybody involved is happy with the process. So it lends itself to provide a pretty safe environment. And just as a side note, we have had groups that, you know, these are private contracts. We know who the people are that are in these groups. And subsequent to a move, we've been notified that someone on that group in that bus tested positive and had symptoms of CD19. We then did a check of our drivers, as you can imagine, with also the contact tracing. None of our drivers, knock wood, since this has started, has tested positive, even when it's been confirmed they've been on a bus with somebody with symptoms that tested positive. And the reason for that is because of the mask requirements and the distancing between the driver and the group. So the first 2 rows at a minimum are never used. And we also use the ventilation system in the bus, and that's key. So as was said throughout this whole presentation so far, masks, social distancing, and ventilation are the key to this, because our drivers never come near passengers. They're in their seat and the passengers will walk by. That's about as close as they're going to get to them. They don't interact with them off or on the bus.
Craig, and from our standpoint, from the OTR, we've been very fortunate. You know, when the virus and pandemic first started, you know, we were very proactive in letting our drivers know that they control their environment. Most of our drivers are in their truck 90% of the time. So when they're really vulnerable is when they get out of that truck. So we've really stressed with our drivers, look, you control what comes into that cab. That's your home. You make sure it's sanitized. You don't let anyone on that truck. And then we've really tried to educate through awareness campaigns and such of when they're outside the truck, what do they need to be aware of, how they need to protect themselves. And I can tell you through today, you know, we have close to 5,000 drivers and we've only had 20 that have been affected where it's been positive. And as someone mentioned earlier, it was because of those interactions where they went home on the weekend, mainly July 4th, and attended barbecues and things of that nature and got sick while they were at home. So obviously they couldn't return. So I can't stress enough to everyone on this call, the importance of the education piece on getting the proper education out there, whether it's the CDC posters, whether it's, you know, providing the CDC links, but getting the true information out there, how masks, social distancing, sanitation standards, getting that information out there. It was very vital in our warehouse operations to have those posters out there. A lot of people, you know, correlate, you know, learning to visualization, not just, you know, hearing it or reading it. So that allowed us to see and protect our warehouse teams as well. And also understand not everyone has the same education level, and definitely can't forget that there's also many different languages that are interpreted. So make sure you provide both in English, Spanish, and Indonesian or whatever of those individuals you have out on your front lines.
Great. Well, it looks like we're at the end of our hour here. I think we got through probably 90% of the questions that were given. But on behalf of Craig and Peter, I want to thank our team of panelists here, Nancy, Amanda, Mike, Todd, and Steve. This was great. We really appreciate all the time. And I think the topics we went over were great. Your feedback was wonderful. So thank you everybody for attending, and we will follow up with some additional information. If there's anything, when we send the follow-up, if there's anything you want to know specifically, please feel free to reply back to us, and we can get some questions answered for you. But on behalf of the Marsh team, I want to thank everybody.
Thank you, everybody. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you, John. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks.